The hammer felt wrong in her hand, a clumsy weight of forged iron and ill-fitting hickory that was not meant for a grip like hers. And each swing was a jarring shock that traveled up her arm and settled like a stone in her shoulder. She was trying to rehang the one good half of the barn door, the half that hadn't been splintered into a sad fan of gray. Weathered planks by a windstorm, she was told, had passed through a month before her arrival, because the wind here had a personality, a temper, and it took things apart just to see how they were made. The sun was a physical pressure on the back of her neck, a dry and unforgiving heat that baked the dust on her skin into a fine crust. And the silence of the valley was so absolute it felt like a sound in itself, a low hum that vibrated just beneath her hearing. This land, this inheritance from a father who was little more than a name on a faded birth certificate, was a vast and broken thing, a testament to neglect. The fences were skeletal, leaning like tired old men. The corrals were filled more with tumbleweeds than with the promise of livestock. And the house itself seemed to be sighing its way back into the dirt, its porch sagging and its windows staring out like vacant eyes. She dropped the hammer and the clatter was an offense against the quiet. Her hands were raw, the soft skin of her palms blistered and torn, stained with rust and the dark sap of old wood. She looked at them not with pity, but with a kind of detached curiosity, as if they belonged to someone else, a woman far more capable than she felt herself to be. The letter had promised a legacy, a place to start over, but it had failed to mention that the starting point was buried under a decade of decay. It had been his, and now it was hers. That was the simple, brutal fact of it. Every splintered board, every rusted nail, every acre of thistle-choked pasture. It was a kingdom of ruin, and she was its solitary queen, armed with a hammer she could barely lift, and a stubbornness that was beginning to feel like the purest form of foolishness. She could leave. The thought was a cool whisper in the heat of the afternoon, a tempting vision of a train ticket and a return to the noise and anonymity of the city. A place where things were built by other people, and her hands could remain soft. But then she looked out at the horizon, at the jagged line of mesas painted in shades of ochre and violet, and felt the sheer, stubborn immensity of the place settle over her. Leaving felt like a surrender not just of the land, but of some vital, untested part of herself. So she bent down, her knees cracking in protest, and picked up the hammer again, its weight familiar now, a solid and uncomfortable truth. She would fix the door, then she would fix the fence, and then the well. She would face each broken piece one at a time, because looking at the whole of it was enough to break her, too. Her name was Alara, though no one here had bothered to ask for it yet, and she was not leaving. Not yet. From his porch a mile away, Silas saw the dust her wagon had kicked up days ago, a faint, lingering haze that told him the old Calloway place finally had a new fool. He had seen them come and go over the years, families with loud, hopeful children, grim-faced men with more ambition than sense. And they all had one thing in common. They were eventually beaten by the land itself, by its patient, grinding indifference. They would arrive in the spring, full of plans and noise, and be gone by the first snow, leaving behind another layer of failure for the sun and the wind to scour away. He had watched her from a distance, a small, determined figure, moving against the backdrop of dilapidation. He watched her try to wrestle the fallen barn door, watched her struggle with a post-hole digger in the rock-hard soil, watched her walk the long, broken fence lines with a slump in her shoulders that grew more pronounced each day. She was city, that much was clear. She moved like someone not yet accustomed to the sheer amount of space around her gestures too small, too contained. She wore the wrong clothes, worked at the wrong times of day, and fought the land with brute force instead of cunning, which was a battle she would never win. Silas sipped his coffee, the tin cup warm in his scarred hands. His own place was small, neat, and defensible, a cabin and a stable tucked against a rock outcropping that broke the wind. He had bought it for its solitude, a place where the past was a distant echo and the future was only as complicated as the next sunrise. He asked for nothing and offered the same. His neighbors were the hawks and the coyotes, and their rules were simple. He understood them. The woman, this Alara, was a complication he had no desire to engage with. Her struggle was her own, a story he had seen before and had no interest in reading again. He had his own routines, his own ghosts to keep at bay. In the morning, he checked his snares. In the afternoon, he worked the leather for a saddle he was tooling, the rhythmic tap of his mallet a conversation with himself. In the evening, he cleaned his revolver, the oiled parts moving with a slick, practiced precision that was second nature, a catechism learned long ago. The weapon was a tool, like his hammer or his axe, but it was one he kept closer. Some things once learned could not be forgotten, no matter how far you ran. He saw the flicker of her lamp late at night, a tiny defiant star in the vast darkness, and he felt a familiar, unwelcome stirring. It was not pity. He had burned all the pity out of himself years ago. It was a flicker of something else, something akin to professional respect for an opponent who refused to concede a lost fight. She was still there. Each morning he would look across the valley, and the small figure would be there, battling her inheritance. He'd give her another month, maybe two if she was lucky. The high desert winter would take care of the rest. He finished his coffee and went inside, the scrape of his boot heels on the wooden floor the only sound. He did not want to know her name. Knowing her name would make it harder to watch her fail. A week after her arrival, a rider approached her small house, not on a workhorse, but on a fine tall bay, with a polished saddle that seemed to sneer at the surrounding poverty. The man who dismounted was dressed in a clean duster, and his boots, Ilara noted, were free of the dust that clung to everything she owned. He moved with an easy, proprietary air, as if he were surveying land that already belonged to him, and his smile was a bright, white slash in a sun-weathered face. He took off his hat, revealing dark, oiled hair. "Ma'am," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "Name's Caldwell. I own the spread to the north of here. Most everything you can see, in fact." He gestured with his hat, a sweeping motion that seemed to dismiss her small, broken patch of earth as an irrelevant interruption in his domain. Ilara stood on her sagging porch, a file for sharpening an old axe head held loosely in her hand. She did not invite him closer. She simply waited. "I knew your father," Caldwell went on, his smile unwavering. "Knew him a little. He was a man who understood the nature of this place. It's hard country. It takes a certain kind of hand to make it prosper." His eyes flickered over her, taking in the worn dress, the smudges of dirt on her cheek, the raw state of her hands. The assessment was swift and dismissive. She was not the certain kind of hand. "I heard you'd come to take over the place," he said, his tone shifting to one of practiced sympathy. "It's a heavy burden for anyone, let alone a woman on her own. Fences down, well, needs seeing to. The stock your father had is long gone. It would take a small fortune and a team of men just to make it break even." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the hot, still air. He was laying out the facts of her failure before it had even fully begun. He was telling her a story about herself, and he expected her to believe it. "So I came to make an offer," he said, finally getting to the point. "As a neighbor, a gesture of goodwill. I'll take this land off your hands, give you a fair price for it, enough to get you back to wherever you came from with something in your pocket." He named a figure. It was an insult, a sum that might have paid for his saddle, but would do little more than cover the cost of her train ticket. It was a price offered to someone with no other options. Ilara looked from his polished boots to his confident eyes. She thought of the blisters on her hands, of the ache in her back that was her constant companion. She thought of the quiet satisfaction she'd felt when she'd finally gotten a single 100-foot section of fence to stand upright and true. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The work was hers. The pain was hers. "No," she said. The word was quiet, unadorned. It was not a negotiation. Caldwell's smile tightened at the edges, a flicker of annoyance breaking through the smooth facade. He hadn't expected to be refused. He had expected gratitude. "Ma'am, you need to be realistic," he said, his voice losing some of its warmth. "This isn't a game. This land has teeth." "I'm aware," Ilara said, her knuckles white around the handle of the file. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Caldwell." She turned without another word and went back inside her house, the screen door slapping shut behind her. It was a dismissal. She did not watch him right away, but she could feel his anger radiating across the yard, a heat more personal and menacing than the sun. The silence that followed his departure was different. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. The first sign was the wire. She had spent 3 exhausting days patching together a section of the southern fence, using scavenged pieces of old wire, her fingers clumsy and slow as she wrestled the stubborn metal into place. The next morning, the wire was cut. It wasn't a break from age or strain. It was a clean, sharp snip, the metal ends gleaming in the morning light. Her small herd of 6 half-wild cattle, purchased at an exorbitant price from a broker in the nearest town, had scattered across the open scrubland. It took her the entire day to find them. The sun was relentless, the landscape a shimmering expanse of heat and dust. Her horse, an old gelding, as worn down as the ranch itself, stumbled and wheezed, and by the time she had the last of the cows cornered against a rock face, she was dizzy with exhaustion and dehydration. She led them back, their hooves kicking up a plume of fine dirt that coated her throat and lungs. She fixed the fence again, her hands shaking with fatigue, her movements clumsy in the fading light. She told herself it was a fluke, a random act of mischief. 2 days later, a different section was cut. This time, the cattle had wandered further, and it took her 2 days to round them all up. 2 days of lost work, of wasted energy, of growing despair. She spent another day repairing the new break, her body screaming in protest. This was not random. This was a message. It was Caldwell's voice, carried on the wind, speaking a language of casual destruction. He wasn't trying to hurt her, not directly. He was just making things difficult. He was applying pressure, demonstrating the truth of his words. This land has teeth, and he was one of them. From his hillside, Silas watched it all. He saw the cut wire. He saw her ride out in the morning, a small, determined shape against the vast landscape, and saw her return long after dusk, slumped in the saddle, a figure of pure exhaustion. He saw her mending the fences alone, her movements becoming slower, less certain with each passing day. He recognized the strategy. It was a siege of 1,000 small cuts, designed to bleed an opponent of will, not blood. It was a coward's tactic, but an effective one. He felt that old, familiar pull, the low thrum of a duty he had tried to abandon. He had sworn off other people's fights. His own had cost him enough. He had paid for his solitude with pieces of himself, and he guarded it jealously. To interfere would be to invite the world back in, to become entangled in the very kind of trouble he had come here to escape. The woman Alara had made her choice. She had refused Caldwell's offer. Now she was living with the consequences. It was her fight, not his. He turned away from the sight of her, his jaw tight, and went back to his leatherwork. The rhythmic tap of the mallet a deliberate, forceful attempt to drown out the voice of his own conscience. But the image of her remained, a solitary figure fighting a battle she could not possibly win, her stubbornness a flickering candle against a gathering wind. And he knew with a certainty that settled in his gut like a cold stone that the wind was only just beginning to blow. The pressure continued, a steady, grinding attrition. A gate left open here, a pile of rocks mysteriously appearing on the narrow track to her house there. A dead coyote thrown into her watering trough, fouling the water for a day. Each incident was small, deniable, but together they formed a relentless campaign. They were designed to wear her down, to make every single task twice as hard, to fill her days with frustrating, pointless labor until she had no energy left to improve her situation. She was no longer fixing the ranch. She was merely surviving it. She lost weight, the already spare frame of her body becoming sharp and angular. There were dark circles under her eyes, and she moved with the grim, joyless economy of someone who knows the day will hold more defeat than victory. The initial spark of stubborn defiance was being smothered under a blanket of pure, bone-deep weariness. She was beginning to understand that Caldwell wasn't just trying to take her land. He was trying to break her spirit first, to make her believe in her own incompetence so that when she finally gave in, it would feel like her own decision, her own failure. One morning she walked out to the northern fence line, the one closest to Silas's property, and found it cut again. She sank to her knees, the dusty earth cool against her skin, and for the first time since arriving, she felt the hot sting of tears. She did not weep. She was too tired for that. The tears simply tracked clean paths through the grime on her cheeks, a quiet admission of despair. She sat there for a long time, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, feeling the vast, crushing indifference of the world around her. She had nothing left. The fight was gone. That afternoon, as she was unsaddling her horse, she saw it. Propped against the porch post was a large, heavy coil of new barbed wire, gleaming with a metallic sheen that was alien in this world of rust and decay. Beside it sat a pair of fencing pliers and a box of staples, their heads shining like silver coins. There was no note, no sign of who had left it. But there was only one other soul within 10 miles. She looked toward the hill where the small, neat cabin sat, a place she knew only as a silhouette against the setting sun. She had never spoken to the man who lived there. She did not even know his name. The gift was not a solution. It was not a promise of help. It was a simple, practical thing, a coil of wire and some tools. But it was also something more. It was an acknowledgement. It was a quiet statement that her struggle had not gone entirely unseen, that she was not just a ghost haunting this forgotten corner of the world. Someone had seen her, and they had not looked away. She picked up the pliers, the tool solid and well-balanced in her hand. So different from the broken, mismatched things she'd been using. She felt its competence, its purpose. For the first time in weeks, the crushing weight on her chest seemed to lift just a little. The tears of the morning had been for her solitude. The wire was a sign that she was not, perhaps, as alone as she had believed. It was enough. For now it was enough. The trip to town was a necessity she dreaded. Her supplies were low, and the new wire, as welcome as it was, had only highlighted how much more she needed. The town was a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings, a place that seemed to tolerate strangers rather than welcome them. When she pushed open the door to the general store, the low murmur of conversation faltered and died. 3 men leaning against the counter turned to look at her, their eyes lingering with a cold, speculative curiosity. The storekeeper, a man with a perpetually sour expression, merely grunted in her direction before turning his attention back to a ledger. She felt their collective gaze on her as she moved through the cramped aisles, a silent judgment that made her skin prickle. They were the chorus, the onlookers in her small, lonely drama, and their silence was a verdict. They had all seen people like her before. They knew how the story ended. She gathered her things, flour, salt, coffee, more staples, her movements stiff and self-conscious. At the counter, the storekeeper tallied her purchases with deliberate, almost insulting slowness. He did not meet her eye. He was treating her not as a customer, but as a temporary problem. As she was counting out her money, the door swung open again, and Caldwell entered, flanked by 2 of his ranch hands. He filled the space, his presence sucking the air from the room. He was laughing, sharing a joke with his men, and the storekeeper, who had been a model of sullen indifference to her, suddenly broke into a wide, sycophantic grin. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice oily with deference, "good to see you." Caldwell nodded, his gaze sweeping the room before landing on Alara. His smile didn't falter, but his eyes went cold. He tipped his hat in a gesture of mocking politeness. "Miss," he said, the single word dripping with condescension. "Stocking up, I see. A wise decision. The nights are getting colder." It wasn't a pleasantry. It was a threat, a reminder that winter was coming, and with it, a new and more formidable adversary than his petty sabotage. The other men in the store watched the exchange, their faces blank, but their eyes missing nothing. She saw the bet in them, the unspoken wager on how many more times she would make this trip before she finally broke and ran. They were not on her side, they were not on his side. They were simply spectators, waiting for the inevitable conclusion. Ilara finished paying, her hands steady despite the tremor she felt inside. She gathered her sacks, her chin held high. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She met his gaze for a brief, defiant moment, her own eyes conveying a message of pure, unyielding stubbornness. Then she turned and walked out, the silence of the store pressing in on her back. Outside, the sunlight felt harsh and interrogating. She loaded her supplies onto her wagon, her movements precise and controlled. The town, the people in it, they were just another part of the landscape she had to endure. Another fence to be mended, another rock to be cleared from the path. They thought they were watching her fail. She would have to prove them wrong. The ride back to the ranch was long and quiet, the silence broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels. She was an outsider, an object of scorn and speculation. The coil of wire on her porch had been a brief respite, but the visit to town was a stark reminder of her true position. She was utterly, completely alone. It was the water that finally broke her. She went to the well in the cool of the morning, the wooden bucket heavy in her hand, and the first thing she noticed was the smell. It was a foul, chemical odor, sharp and unnatural, that clung to the air. When she drew the bucket up, the water wasn't clear. It was slick with a greasy rainbow-colored film that shimmered on the surface. It was poison. She dropped the bucket, its clatter against the stone wellhead, a sharp, ugly sound. She ran to the trough where her old horse, Jasper, was drinking. He lifted his head and she saw the foam at his lips, the wild, pained look in his eyes. He stumbled, his legs buckling, and went down with a heavy, groaning sigh. This was different. This was a new kind of cruelty. Cutting fences was an inconvenience. Poisoning a well, sickening an animal, that was a violation. It was an act of pure malice, a move that went beyond the cold calculus of business and into the realm of personal hatred. Caldwell was no longer just trying to drive her off. He was trying to hurt her. He was punishing her for her defiance. Ilara fell to her knees beside the struggling horse, her hands fluttering uselessly over his heaving sides. This was the heart of her ranch, the one source of clean water for miles. Without it, she had nothing. The cattle could not drink. She could not drink. The small garden she had painstakingly coaxed from the dry soil would wither and die. This was not a setback, it was a death sentence. All the fight, all the stubborn resolve she had clung to for weeks evaporated in that single, foul-smelling moment. The weight of it all came crashing down on her. The endless work, the isolation, the sneering faces in town, the constant, grinding pressure. It was too much. The land, the silence, the sheer empty space that she had tried to fill with her own will, had finally swallowed her whole. She did not cry. She was beyond tears. She simply knelt in the dust beside her dying horse, her head bowed, a solitary, defeated figure in a kingdom of ruin that had finally, irrevocably, claimed its victory. The sun rose higher, the heat began to build, and she did not move. There was nowhere left to go. The fight was over. She had lost. Silas saw it from his porch. The stillness. For weeks he had watched the constant, dogged motion from the Callaway place. The woman walking the fences, riding out for cattle, working in the yard. But this morning, there was only a profound and troubling lack of movement. Her figure was a small, unmoving knot of despair by the well, and it had not stirred for over an hour. That kind of stillness in the desert meant one of two things: peace or death. He knew which one this was. He put down his coffee cup, the decision made without conscious thought. It was no longer a choice. A line had been crossed, a rule of the wilderness broken. You could fight a man for territory, you could test his strength, but you did not poison the water. Water was life, and to poison it was to declare war not just on a person, but on the land itself. He walked, his stride long and unhurried. He didn't take his horse. He wanted to feel the ground beneath his boots, to let the slow, rhythmic pace settle his mind. He crossed the shallow arroyo that separated their properties, the land he had sworn never to set foot on. He found her just as he had seen her from his porch, kneeling in the dust, her face pale and empty. He didn't need to ask what had happened. The acrid smell from the well and the sight of the downed horse told the story. He looked at the water, then at the animal's labored breathing. He looked at her, at the utter devastation in her posture. He said nothing to her. Words were useless here. He turned and walked back the way he had come, his path intersecting the track that led to the main road. He didn't have to wait long. He heard the sound of shod hooves and lazy laughter before he saw them. It was two of Caldwell's men. They reined in their horses when they saw him standing in the middle of the path, a solitary, unmoving obstacle. "Morning, old man," one of them said, a smirk on his face. "You lost?" "It's done," Silas said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It was a statement of fact. The other man laughed. "Don't know what you're talking about. We're just enjoying the morning air." He had a confident, arrogant look, the look of a man who believes he holds all the power. "Tell Caldwell," Silas said, his eyes as hard and empty as river stones, "this ground is not for sale, and he's not to come back." The first man's smirk widened. He shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting casually toward the pistol on his hip. "That sounds like an order, and we don't take orders from—" He never finished the sentence. Silas moved. It wasn't the explosive speed of a young man, but something more terrifying. The absolute economy of motion that comes from a lifetime of violence. A blur, a step, a twist. There was a sharp, wet crack of bone, and the man was on the ground, clutching a hand bent at an impossible angle, his face a mask of shock and agony. The other man froze, his own hand hovering over his gun, his eyes wide with a sudden understanding. He was not looking at some broken-down old homesteader. He was looking at something else entirely, something he had only heard stories about. "Go," Silas said, his voice still quiet, still level. "Tell him." The man didn't need to be told twice. He wheeled his horse around, dragging his friend's mount with him, and spurred them into a frantic gallop, leaving the injured man whimpering in the dust. Silas did not watch them go. He turned his back and walked back toward the well. He returned to find Alara in the same spot, though she had lifted her head and was watching him approach, her expression a mixture of fear and dazed confusion. He walked past her without a word and went to the well. He grabbed the fouled bucket, emptied it on the ground far from the trough, and found the long rope. He fashioned a loop for his boot, tested its hold, and then, to her astonishment, began to lower himself into the dark, narrow shaft. The work was brutal and dangerous. He spent the rest of the day and most of the next down in the suffocating darkness, hauling up bucket after bucket of poisoned water and contaminated silt, sending them up for her to drag away and dump. She worked automatically at first, a numb automaton following unspoken instructions. But as the hours passed, a new rhythm took hold. She brought him fresh water from a small cask he'd brought from his own cabin. She sharpened tools. She cleared the area around the wellhead. She worked alongside him, the shared, physical labor, a language more eloquent than any words they could have spoken. They did not talk about what had happened with Caldwell's men. They did not talk about his past or hers. They spoke of the work. "More rope. The bucket's frayed. Watch your hands." The words were clipped, functional, but beneath them, something else was being built. It was a partnership forged in the dirt and the dark, a silent acknowledgement of a shared purpose. He showed her how to mix a lye solution to scour the stone walls of the well, his large scarred hands guiding her own as they worked the paste into the rock. He taught her how to listen to the sound of the water as it began to seep back in, to tell the clean from the tainted. While they waited for the well to refill, he turned his attention to her horse. He dosed the animal with charcoal and oil, his touch gentle and sure, his low voice a soothing murmur as he worked. He sat with the horse through the night, and by morning the old gelding was on its feet, shaky but alive. Alara watched him, this quiet, dangerous man who had appeared out of the silence and methodically begun to put her world back together. He was not kind, not in the soft, easy way she was used to. His kindness was practical, competent, and utterly unsentimental. It was in the solid new handle he fitted to her axe, the way he rehung the barn door so it swung true and smooth. The knot he taught her that would not slip. He was not saving her. He was showing her how to save herself. The work was still hard, the days still long, but the crushing weight of her solitude was gone. It had been replaced by the steady, reassuring presence of a man who met the world with a quiet, unshakable competence. The ranch was still broken, but for the first time she believed it could be mended. Months passed. The relentless heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The land, which had been an adversary, softened. The air smelled of dry grass and distant rain. The ranch was slowly, painstakingly coming back to life. The fences were whole, a neat patchwork of old and new wire that stretched across the property, a testament to countless hours of labor. The well water ran sweet and clear. The barn door, now fully repaired and painted, stood as a solid barrier against the wind. Her small herd of cattle had grown, a new calf sticking close to its mother's side. The ranch was not prosperous, not yet, but it was solvent. It was holding. Alara had changed too. The sun had browned her skin and etched fine lines around her eyes. Her body was leaner, corded with a wiry strength she hadn't known she possessed. Her hands, once soft and raw, were now calloused and capable, tools in their own right. She moved with a new economy, a quiet confidence born of knowing the land, of having met its challenges and endured. The fear was gone, replaced by a deep, abiding resilience. She was no longer a visitor here. She belonged. That evening, she sat on her porch, cleaned and mended from the day's work, watching the sky bleed into shades of purple and orange. She saw a figure walking from the direction of the neighboring cabin. It was Silas. He carried 2 rabbits, cleaned and dressed, in one hand. He stopped at the bottom of her porch steps and simply held them up. "Figured you were tired of beans," he said. It was the longest sentence he had spoken to her in a month. She nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "I am." He came up onto the porch and they cooked the rabbits together over a small fire she built in the yard, the smell of roasting meat mingling with the cool evening air. They ate in a comfortable silence, a silence that was no longer empty but full, a shared space between 2 people who understood each other without the need for explanation. They watched the last of the light fade from the mesas, the first stars beginning to appear in the vast dark sky. He had not let her fail, but more than that, he had shown her that she was capable of not failing on her own. He had given her back not just her ranch, but her own strength. It was not a grand romance, not a dramatic rescue. It was something quieter and perhaps more profound. It was a shared meal. It was a mended fence. It was the quiet dignity of a hard-won peace. It was not an ending. It was a beginning. Thank you for being here, for staying with this story until the very end. We often think of strength as something loud, something that announces itself. But so often, true strength, the kind that endures, is quiet. It's the resilience to get up one more time than you fall, the courage to mend what's broken, even when your own hands are raw. It's the quiet decision to help a neighbor, not for thanks, but because it's the right thing to do. The world can be a hard place, full of casual cruelty and indifference. It can make you feel isolated, like your struggles are going completely unseen. But every now and then, a simple act of competence, of shared work, of quiet support, can change everything. It can be the coil of wire left on a porch, a silent testament that you are not, in fact, alone. Have you ever been close to giving up, only to have a small, unexpected act of grace from someone else give you the strength to keep going? We'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Your experiences enrich this community and remind us all of the power of quiet kindness. And if you found value in this story, we hope you'll consider liking and subscribing. It allows us to continue bringing you tales of resilience, dignity, and the quiet strength that lives within us all. Until next time, be well and be good to one another.